Let's pray. Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight. O God, our rock, our strength, our Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. It was the fourth grade end-of-year party. We were at my teacher, Mr. Donnelly's house on Little Punderson Lake, and we were swimming. I mean, teachers, can you imagine doing a party today where they actually let the kids swim? But we were. Now, I love to swim. I did it a lot. One of the great things about growing up at summer camp was I had free Red Cross swimming lessons all summer. I usually would take 2 or even 3 sessions. I was an advanced swimmer before I was out of elementary school. But you know, other people in my fourth grade class, they did not have that advantage. They clearly did not swim so much, including a boy named Chad. I will always remember looking over that afternoon and seeing him about 10 feet away with panic in his eyes and his head just above the water. Now, Chad was not splashing around. He could not call out. He didn't have any breath for that. He was quietly close to drowning, and I was the only one who saw it. I didn't think about it much. I just swam over to him, and he grabbed me. He grabbed me so tightly, it hurt. I can still feel it today. And I'll be honest, it was a bit of a struggle. But I got both of us out of the deep water, out of the weeds, to where our feet could touch the bottom again. And Chad naturally took a break from swimming for the rest of the afternoon. But I was having fun, so I stayed in the water. I'm not sure either of us ever said anything about it to anyone. Now this morning, our Bible passages, they actually give us a 3-paned picture, a triptych of water. And they tell us that God rules the water, and that God rescues from the water, and that Jesus, he comes to us across the water. And together, they answer a question for us. They answer one question. When we are drowning in life, who can reach us? Who can save us? Now, the first pane of our picture is the Psalm 29. This is page 461 in the Blue Bibles, if you'd like to turn there. Psalm 29, it has a message. That message is God rules over the waters. This is a psalm that pulls no punches when it comes to the holiness, when it comes to the power of God, does it? There's just so many power words here. There's mighty and strength and honor and worship. And that's just in the first 2 verses. But notice what God has power over. There's a specific point here. Verse 3, it is the Lord who commands what? The waters. And then to verse 4, it's the Lord that rules the sea. And then finally in verse 9, it is the Lord that sits above the floodwaters. The message of Psalm 29 is clear. Waters. And you have to kind of have in your head that for Hebrew people, waters aren't just like, hey, let's go swimming. Waters are chaos. Water is something you cannot control and may kill you. We don't think of this much today, but think about it. If you're in the ancient world, and on one hand, water is like the Mediterranean. You can go places, but you have so little control over the weather. You don't really know what's going to happen. There's not meteorology like we have today. And the ships they're using, I mean, they are not actually what we would necessarily think of as seaworthy. You are absolutely at the mercy of the sea, and people knew it. And for Hebrew people, they knew that, and one of the things they connected the sea with was chaos. But the message of Psalm 29 is clear. All that chaos, the waters, well, they have a master, and they have a ruler, and it's the Lord. There, God's power extends over the most chaotic, massive, uncontrollable thing they know, which is the sea. And not only is God the Lord of the waters, the Lord of even that most chaotic force in the world, but Psalm 29 tells us right at the end that at the end of the day, all that chaos that the waters represent will be corralled by God, and calm will reign. Did you catch that at the end? Verse 10 says that the Lord shall give his people the blessing of peace. I just imagine peace coming over the Mediterranean Sea, honestly, over a massive body of water. That is kind of the picture we're supposed to have here. So that's a good start to our three-paned painting of water. God rules the waters. Psalm 29 says so. But we need more to answer our question, right? When we are drowning, who can save us? Who can save us? When the chaos is up to our eyeballs, who can save us? And that brings us to our second watery window pane, Jonah chapter 2. God rescues from the waters. Jonah chapter 2. This is page 774 in the Blue Bibles. You may be tempted to say, I can find Jonah, and maybe you can. But actually, it's a tiny book, actually, in the Minor Prophets. So if you want some help, page 774 in the Blue Bibles. You see, Jonah is in a good position to know about the chaos of the waters, right? And to know about God's ability to rescue someone drowning in them. And Jonah actually tells us part of his story in chapter 2. He says, the waters, they closed over me to take my life. And he says, the weeds were wrapped around my head. And one of the things I do remember very well about going out to Chad was the weeds. The weeds catching around our feet. I can't imagine them wrapped around your head. I mean, you are doomed if you were at that point. Yeah, and I saw that, Charlie. It probably wouldn't feel very good either. You know. The weeds were wrapped around my head. He is a drowning man. He is as good as dead. And in a sense, if you know the story of Jonah, well, he kind of brought this on himself, didn't he? He was a rebel prophet trying and failing to run from God. And just think of the imagery here. From a Hebrew perspective, the sea is chaos. And what is Jonah doing? He's choosing chaos over God. He is choosing chaos over God. He's trying and failing to make a run for it. And the waters, well, he's in them. And he's going to drown. But what comes next? Well, the great fish, right? And that fish in the story of Jonah, well, it's not just a further attack on this rebellious prophet. It's not primarily a punishment. Instead, that fish is actually something much stranger. It's a rescue, right? It is God reaching Jonah. It's having the fish swallow him before the deep swallows him up. And Jonah gets it. God has saved him. He actually says it in verse 9. He says, salvation belongs to the Lord. This is not just general salvation. This is not like, well, generally God is the one we connect the word salvation with. This is, I was drowning and God has saved me. So when we are drowning, Jonah 2 tells us, it's God who can reach us, who can save. That's what he did for Jonah. And Jesus himself knew and it seems to have actually really liked the story of Jonah because he saw some of his own life prefigured in it. And he actually says this in Matthew chapter 12, verse 40. He says, as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. For Jesus, Jonah's descent into the deep, into the chaotic deep of the sea, becomes a sign of Jesus' own descent into death. And in both cases, the story ends not with death, but with God's salvation, right? So Psalm 29, the Lord is master over the waters. Jonah chapter 2, the Lord can save out of the waters. Now we're at the center panel of our triptych, and that's Matthew 14. Jesus, he comes to us. He comes to us on the waters. This is page 820 in the Blue Bibles. And yeah, I know I have you turning around a lot today, but no, that isn't quite right. We're not turning around. We're turning to different pages. But I think it's important for us to see these passages. So this is page 820, Matthew chapter 14. So what do we find in Matthew 14? I mean, what's Jesus actually doing here? Well, it seems he's simply going for a walk on the Sea of Galilee through a thunderstorm, right past a foundering boat of his disciples, sometime around 3 a.m. You know, like people do. I mean, no wonder Matthew says the disciples were terrified and said, this is a ghost. I mean, what are they supposed to think? But it's not a ghost. Immediately Jesus spoke to them, this is verse 27, saying, take heart, it is I. It is I. Do not be afraid. So when we are drowning, do not be afraid. Jesus can reach us. And you know, there are also these words that Jesus actually says to his disciples to get them to stop worrying about ghosts in this moment. And I want to draw your attention particularly to just three of them right in the middle of Jesus' statement in verse 27. It is I. It is I. Now, some of us may even recognize the Greek phrase behind this. Ego eime. That is, I am. Ego eime. Well, it is I is a fine translation of this little phrase. I think it obscures for us just a bit the implications of what Jesus is telling his disciples here in verse 27. I mean, that's the challenge of translation, right? Sometimes it both clarifies but also cannot help but to obscure what's going on. You see, these three words, two in Greek, ego eime, I am, well, they are probably the most loaded two words of the entire Bible. You know, when Moses asks God his name before the burning bush, all the way back in Exodus, what does God say to Moses? He says, I am who I am. Ego eime hoon. Ego eime. That's in the Greek translation, actually the translation of the Bible that Jesus knew. And Jesus, he uses these words of himself as well. He says this in John chapter 8, verse 58, truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am. Now, I'm tempted to go on an excursus here. I'm going to keep it a little short, but I'm going to say something. Sometimes you will hear people say, well, Jesus, he never claimed to be divine. What? Come on. You know, he uses the name of God for himself, and not only that, but the people know exactly what he's saying. We see this here in John chapter 8. What happens after he says, before Abraham was, I am? Well, people try to stone him. They throw rocks at him because they recognize fully that he is applying the name of God to himself. But back to Matthew 14. You see, I kept that short. I'm kind of proud of myself there. Back to Matthew 14. Back to Jesus, the man walking on the water. He is telling his disciples, first of all, that he rules the waters of Psalm 29. And secondly, he rescues from the waters, just like God rescued Jonah. He's saying, I'm the same guy. It's me. I am. Each pane of our watery triptych this morning, well, it meets right here. It meets in Jesus on the waters of the Sea of Galilee. I mean, no wonder Peter gets all excited and says, Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you on the waters. By the way, that if it's you here, that's one of those questions that assumes a positive response. Peter's not actually in doubt. He's just saying more like, since it's you, come on, I want to do something. Command me to come to you on the waters. I somewhat imagine Jesus rolling his eyes here. I don't know that. But going, okay, fine, Peter. Come on, come. So Peter does. He climbs out of the boat. But like a lot of things Peter does in the gospel, well, it doesn't quite go to plan, does it? But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and he began to sink. You see, what begins as a bold act of faith, well, becomes a desperate need for rescue, for Jesus to actually be I am, to be the water's ruler, and to be Peter's salvation in that moment. And that's what happens, right? Jesus immediately, he reaches out his hand and took hold of him. When we are drowning, who can reach us? Well, it's Jesus. That's the heart of this whole picture. Psalm 29 tells us the waters have a Lord. Jonah tells us the Lord can reach into the deep to save. And Matthew 14 shows us that Lord is Jesus, and his hand is near enough to grab a sinking man. Well, okay, very nice, right? But what does that get us? What does that get you? What does that get me this morning? Well, friends, there is actually more here than information. And there's more here than this. I think it's actually a very powerful identification of Jesus with God, but there's more here than that. I just want us to notice two verbs in our passages. The first is from Jonah chapter 2, verse 2. And it's this: Jonah, he calls out. He says, I cried out from the belly of the whale. Now, I think this is a little crazy. Again, excursus temptation, but I'll try to keep it controlled. Is this whole chapter 2, this very poetic chapter, in Jonah is composing this in the whale's belly. I'm not sure I would be doing that in the belly of a fish, but that's kind of the image here. He's calling out. He's calling out from the belly of the fish. And then, of course, there's Peter. He does what? He cries out, right? We got his words. They're great. He's a lot simpler than Jonah. We do not get, he wasn't there for 3 days, I suppose. But instead of a long poem, we get 3 words. We get, Lord, save me. Lord, save me. And friends, the takeaway for us, I think it's very simple. When we are drowning, we'll call out, cry out. The great news of the gospel is that Jesus is close enough to hear us. Even if our voice is only a whisper, he's close enough to see us, even if our heads are just barely above the water. Frankly, even if we're under the water. And that's because Jesus himself has plumbed the deepest and darkest places there are. That's what Jesus did when he was on the cross and when he went to the grave. And he tells us so, and he connects it to Jonah. Remember, as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. The Lord has been there. The Lord of the universe, the great I am, sank so deep into death and into the grave that there is no trip into darkness that any of us can make that can take us out of his reach. Just let the implications of that sink in your own life this morning. Jesus is near you, even in the hospital emergency room. Jesus is near you when depression and anxiety have taken over your thoughts. And Jesus is near you when your job doesn't make sense and you aren't sure you can do it anymore. You can fill in your own places, I'm sure, as well. Call out, cry out, pray. It's hard to beat Peter's prayer in the end, isn't it? Lord, save. Just ask Jesus to rescue. And be confident, because he does that. He is nearer than we can imagine, no matter how deep and dark it is. And here's the beautiful thing. You know, when I was in fourth grade in the weedy waters of Little Punderson Lake, it was Chad. It was Chad who grabbed me and held on so tightly I can still feel it. But notice how it was with Jesus in Matthew 14. He's the one who grabs Peter. Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him. I mean, Matthew never says anything about how tightly Peter held on. It's Jesus' power as the I am that does the rescuing work we need. You know, on Little Punderson Lake, well, I stayed up, and I didn't drown with Chad, which you may well know often happens in a rescue. Great thing about being a fourth grader is that was not top of mind at the time. I stayed up, just barely, because Chad was a bit smaller than I was. If he'd been bigger, he absolutely would have taken me down with him. I mean, that's just how gravity and buoyancy work. Our rescuer, Jesus, he voluntarily went down, past the weeds, past the deep, into the heart of the dark earth. And he was brought up again on the third day so he could raise us up as well. When we are drowning, who can reach us? Jesus. Amen.